To order and have a roll call.
Alderperson Robinson. Hurt.
Here.
Tweet.
Here.
Swanson.
Here.
Parker.
Here.
Pulis.
Here.
Healy.
Here.
And Mayor Tomes.
Here. Thank you. All right, public comment. Nobody has signed up for public comments, so that takes care of that one. We're item number 4, presentation of housing needs. Is that Nicole? And let's see, you know how to turn the microphone on up there?
So, test. Can you guys hear me? All right. Good evening. So I'm Nicole Mata, and I'm the Community Development Manager. And so I work on all HUD-related things, grants and funding. And I'm joined tonight by the Community Development Managers, also of Moline, which is KJ Whitley in the blue. And then we have Heather Johnson, she's with Davenport. And then we have Dawn Cameron, who's also with Davenport. So we all have worked on these reports as a regional group. And so we will have, So we're all recipients, obviously, of the CDBG federal funds. So the cities Rock Island, Moline, and Davenport were required by HUD to complete the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, also known as, you'll hear as an AI for abbreviation, and then also the housing needs assessment, which will also be the HNA, which will be referenced. So the 3 cities entered into a regional consortium to complete these reports. The information is used to complete the next 2025 through 2028 consolidated plan. So these documents will also be incorporated into the strategic housing development plan that will be coming later this year in March and April. Some more detailed information with these reports incorporated in them. So tonight we're going to have the analysis of impediments to fair housing. That's going to be presented by Jeremy Gray and his team, and they are presenting with Mosaic. And then we also have Brian Points and his team that will be consulting, that will be going over the housing needs assessment. They both will be doing that virtually and answering any questions, so they have a little PowerPoint that each will do. Mosaic and Jeremy with Mosaic will start first, and then Brian will do his report after. So after all this information is done, basically the final report, we will be back next month. So we're taking this as a presentation. We'll take any comments, incorporate any of that information that we get into the final draft, and we'll bring it back in for a resolution then in February with those comments or information updated in the plan. So with that being said, I'm hoping that they're all logged in, and we'll start with Jeremy Gray with Mosaic. Thank you.
They cannot hear us, yeah. Are you doing that?
What?
Changing the screen?
Oh, now I can't even do my minutes because I'm presenting?
Yeah, you get, yeah, it's one or the other.
Okay, I'm sorry.
How is this?
That's great for the volume.
Now I don't know what I did for the screen. I don't know how to get back to that.
Maybe I
Okay,
gotta
are
do
you
it again.
hearing now?
Or no, there it goes. So I can't do my
Great.
minutes.
Okay, I'm going to hang up the
Unless
call.
Tim, no, you can't. I think Tim,
Hi, everyone,
took care of the
Mayor and members of
No, I see.
council. Sorry
back.
for the
try it. Go back to yours.
technological problems there, but I think we are connected now,
Hang it.
and everything seems to be working.
You're still mumbled a
Um,
little bit.
I know Nicole already provided an introduction to the project that we're working on, and I will jump right into my part of it, which has to do with the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. One thing that I will point out, so this is a study that we conducted for the 3 cities, so Rock Island, along with the city of Moline and Davenport. This analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one thing that I'll say right off the bat here is that HUD requires each of the 3 cities to produce one of these documents. And so I would just say, don't take for granted the fact that your 3 cities all are working together on a single document here. There are some parts of this that might pertain more to some of the other cities than to Rock Island. However, I think in taking on the effort for the 3 cities together. And I imagine that Brian from Points Consulting might say the same about his portion of the study. Makes a lot more sense to us as consultants. You're a single market, and also makes a lot of sense, I think, for the cities and how they're working together. So the city of Rock Island receives about $1 million a year from HUD through the Community Development Block Grant Program. And in receiving that funding, the city certifies to HUD that it will affirmatively further fair housing. It's one of the strings that is attached to that grant money. And here you have, this is the definition in the federal regulations of what it means to affirmatively further fair housing. So it means going above and beyond just combating discrimination, but working harder than that to overcome patterns of segregation, and fostering inclusive communities that are free of barriers that restrict people's access to opportunity based on their protected characteristics. We'll talk about protected characteristics throughout this presentation. It means classes protected by the Federal Fair Housing Act. So that might be race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. One of the ways that HUD's grantees are able to document that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing is a study called an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And so what that analysis does, it's kind of the beginning step of affirmatively furthering fair housing. It's a self-study of fair housing conditions, the local landscape related to housing and fair housing. It studies 4 particular areas that I'll call attention to because I'm going to present a little bit of data on each of these 4 bullets in the middle of the slide. So racial integration and segregation, areas of poverty, particularly where poverty might become concentrated in an area of minority residents, access to opportunity, and housing need. Particularly among housing need, we look at cost burden, so households that are spending more than 30% of their incomes on their housing costs. But it does also include some other factors like substandard housing conditions and overcrowding as well. And so the study concludes with a set of fair housing impediments, things that have been identified through the data that we've reviewed, and a set of recommendations, things that the city and other local partners can do to work toward ameliorating some of those fair housing impediments. And so then that sets the city forward in this process to affirmatively further fair housing, and then implementing those recommendations would be the next step in that process. Just a brief timeline on the project that we've been working on. So back in the summer, we were there in Rock Island and in the other cities conducting some community engagement, gathering data. We spent the fall putting that data together into a report, analyzing what we were seeing and drafting that document. And then December and January has been the process of sharing drafts kind of internally with city staff, and this evening with you for some feedback. And then, as Nicole mentioned, in February, a final version of the document will come back to you.
Hey, Jeremy, sorry to interrupt you. Passing on a message I saw in the chat that you may not have seen. I think that they might be seeing your other screen because the slides aren't advancing on their end.
Okay.
That'll work. Yep.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, okay. So I apologize for that. I had shared a couple of slides already, but Brian caught me before we got into any of the maps or the data that I think you'll be most interested in. So I switched into presentation mode so it would be larger, but I'm not sure if that was working. So I'll just keep it like this. I was going to talk about community engagement and just touch on a few of the things that we did to engage the community, because I think we had a good outcome from the effort that we put in here. There was a housing survey and points. Brian is going to talk, I think, more about that. They led that effort. But there were over 700 responses from the community to that survey. And so that provided a lot of helpful information for us. We held a series of community meetings, a virtual meeting for anyone in the region, but also some in-person meetings as well. We held pop-up events, and so finding activities or events that are already happening in the community and tabling at those. So, for example, we were at the Soul of the City Festival in Rock Island back in the summer. We went to a South Rock Island Township giveaway and set up there, talked with people who are coming and going. A few others in other cities in the region as well. Resident focus groups. We did small focus groups with seniors, with people with disabilities, with immigrants and refugees. And also we did one with the Quad Cities Housing Cluster. So other ways that we were using to get information from people who live in the community and might be most impacted by fair housing issues and also less likely to attend a meeting. So finding other alternative ways to reach those populations was important to us. So I'll share then, from here. Okay. So I'll share then some of the data that we were looking at. And also just 4 examples here. There's a lot more data in the report. And if you wanted to pour through those pages, I encourage you to. But I'll just highlight a few things for you here. So one of those key areas that we look at in an analysis of impediments is racial and ethnic integration and segregation. And you see here a map showing the composition by race and ethnicity in the Quad Cities. The orange color that you see, which is scattered pretty predominantly throughout the region, is the white population. And in Rock Island, you can see that there is quite a bit of mixtures. Integration is what we would call that, especially in the northeast portion of the city. There is, so you can see that you may be able to see that those orange dots are pretty evenly interspersed with a lot of green dots, which represents the Black population. Also blue and pink dots, which represent Hispanic and Asian residents, respectively. But then you can also see there are areas that are less diverse. There's a pink outline here around an area. It's almost all green dots, not entirely, but close, which represents the Black population. And so there is some segregation within the city of Rock Island. You can also see maybe if you cross the Rock River, the city is less diverse. In that southern portion, also southeast Rock Island around the golf course, much more heavily white there and much less representation of some of the other racial and ethnic groups present in the city in that pocket. We also look at poverty concentrations, and You can see here the brighter shading, this yellow and the bright green is representing higher poverty rates. We do see some of that here in Rock Island. And if I'm going to go back a slide, you can see that one of those areas of high poverty rate also represents an area of racial concentration, and that's what that pink outline is indicating. We call it a RECAP, which stands for racially or ethnically concentrated area of poverty. So that census tract within the city has a non-white population that's greater than 50% and a poverty rate that's greater than 40%. And that's the threshold for one of those concentrated areas of poverty. Going back, to the poverty rate then, that kind of highlights these, but you also see some areas, again, around the golf course, the southeast portion of Rock Island, poverty rate below 10% there. And so relatively affluent compared to the rest of the region and the city. And then we looked at access to opportunity, which I mentioned earlier, probably could bear a little bit more explanation around that concept. When we think of opportunity, what we're meaning here are access to the amenities, the features that people desire and need in their neighborhoods in order to thrive. Those could be related to access to schools, access to jobs and employment. It could be access to transportation options, access to healthy environmental factors. All of those things we map, and I pulled out just this one. This is school proficiency. It's a HUD index. We don't develop the figures here, but it's based on standardized test scores at the 4th grade level. The brighter shading, so the yellow and the bright green, is indicating lower levels of school proficiency. And kind of the core of Rock Island is represented in that color. When you go to the southern portion of the city, southwest, across the river, the Rock River, those scores do improve. This is something that we look at because we want to compare this with some of those maps that look at racial and ethnic composition. So by virtue of where you live in the city of Rock Island, what sorts of resources and amenities do you have access to or not have access to? And that's important. The final piece of data that I'm going to share with you here is related to housing problems. Rock Island is on the rightmost column of this chart. We did include Davenport and Moline here as well, just as a basis for comparison. Housing problems. So again, primarily this relates to cost burden, housing or households spending more than 30% of their incomes on their housing. But it does also include substandard housing conditions and overcrowding. You can see about 30%, 29.1% of the city of Rock Island households do have one or more housing problems. Again, predominant there is going to be cost burden. There are just some disparities, though, when you break that down by race and ethnicity. And so the city's white population has about 23% of those households have housing problems. That number jumps up dramatically, though, if you compare that to, say, the Asian population. More than half of those residents have a housing problem. If you look at the Black residents in the city of Rock Island, 43%, just about, of those have housing problems. And so that's, not quite double, but much higher than the rate of white households with the same sort of condition there. You compare that across the cities, and Rock Island's white population is a little bit less likely to have housing problems than in Davenport or Moline, but also the city's Black population is a little bit more likely. And the same could be said for the Hispanic population. Also, Hispanic residents in Rock Island more likely to have cost burden or other housing problems than in Davenport or Moline. So I share that just as a sampling, really, a taste of some of the data that is included in our report. There's lots more in there. I'm sure you will have questions and we can talk about those. But I'm going to move on now into the 4 impediments that we identified. And I'll highlight a couple of the recommendations that we proposed related to each impediment. These aren't the entire list of recommendations. There are more in the report, but we pulled out just a few to highlight for you. So the first impediment is insufficient access to affordable housing. Really just there are not enough affordable units. There's not enough of it. But also if you dig into that further, when you think about housing needs for larger families, larger units are not affordable for larger families. In a lot of cases, affordable units that are available tend not to have accessibility features that people with disabilities might need in order to access those. And so there are lots of different dimensions and ways that we can cut across this lack of affordable housing issue, but it does affect some populations disproportionately. What we would recommend here is that the city continue to use CDBG funds. Rock Island doesn't receive home funds. Davenport does, but they cannot be used in Rock Island. But you can use your CDBG allocation where possible to increase and maintain the availability of high quality, affordable rental and for sale housing. So I think it's important to highlight both of those. This is not just a rental housing need. It's not just a for sale housing need. More housing of any kind is going to be helpful to alleviating the affordability challenges. Also, the state of Illinois allocates tax credits under the low-income housing tax credit program each year. It puts together something called a qualified allocation plan that outlines how those credits get allocated to projects. The tax credit program is really the most important source of new affordable housing funding kind of across the board at this point in time. And so I think having staff or others partners within the community closely following the state's qualified allocation plan, identifying opportunities to propose a project or to recruit a developer to propose a project in the city of Rock Island, and anything that the city can do, letters of support of that sort that can make a developer's application for tax credit funding more competitive can make a big difference in actually recruiting projects and housing to the city. The second impediment, lack of targeted investment in underserved areas, resulting in increasing disparities in access to opportunity. And what we mean here, this really is coming from that access to opportunity data. So when we look at all of those opportunity factors and when we map those, it does indicate some disparities in access. So for example, the map that I shared was school proficiency data. I think opening a dialogue or with the school system, sharing some of that data, the city obviously is going to be pretty limited in what it can do with regard to school quality. That's the school district matter, but kind of opening data as a resource, anything that we could put in the school district's hands to aid them in their planning could be helpful. Encouraging applications from local nonprofit organizations to apply to the city for CDBG funding so that they could implement job training or employment assistance programs, things to help bring jobs into some of those lower opportunity portions of the city. Again, the city itself is limited in what it can do, but it does have that CDBG funding available. And so encouraging applications from nonprofits that could serve that need could be beneficial. And then encouraging kind of really ongoing collaborative work among the three cities to align their respective community revitalization efforts. I don't know that it's necessary or it may not even be a best practice for the three cities to put together any sort of a regional single revitalization plan, but each of the cities does have its own revitalization effort in place. And so kind of aligning those where possible, communication among the cities so that they're working toward the same goals might be helpful. Number 3, insufficient and unequally distributed publicly supported housing options. In Rock Island, we noticed this particularly among the distribution of people using housing choice vouchers, or what is more commonly called Section 8 vouchers. Kind of the beauty of those voucher programs is that the idea is the tenant can take that voucher to housing of their choice anywhere they want, and that voucher is going to help them make up the cost difference between what they can afford and what the rent is being charged by the landlord or the property manager. However, when in Rock Island, those vouchers tend to be concentrated in certain parts of the city. And so again, it's that southeast portion of the city has almost no vouchers in use there. And the same can be also said of some other publicly supported or subsidized housing types. There are programs called 811 and 202, federal programs that provide housing for seniors, housing for people with disabilities. There are none of those available currently in the city of Rock Island. And so just some options to encourage better distribution of voucher use across the city so that those aren't all used in the same portions of the city, but also maybe bringing in additional resources for affordable housing within Rock Island. And lastly, fair housing education and equitable enforcement. There is fair housing education that happens in Rock Island. There are organizations that serve this need. That's true in all three of the cities. And I do think that in this case, some sort of a coordinated effort among those three, the efforts in those three cities can be helpful, just so that the messaging that's reaching the community is the same. I think also looking for ways to really provide messaging around fair housing in culturally appropriate ways, particularly to non-English speaking communities. One of those focus groups that we held was with World Relief, with some of the immigrant and refugee populations that they serve. And, just there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for landlords or property managers to take advantage of tenants who don't have good communication skills, at least in English. And so, helping those constituencies, those residents, to understand what their rights are, how to go about ensuring their fair housing rights is important. And that can also kind of, this third bullet works into that as well. So working through existing organizations that are serving those populations is really an important key to getting information to them. So again, that was just a few highlights of some of the data contained in the analysis of impediments, and then just shared with you the 4 different impediments and highlighted a few of our recommendations related to each of those. So I will stop here and happy to hear questions or comments, or if you are ready for Brian and his group to take it away with the housing needs assessment, that is good with me too.
I think you can continue on.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I'm going to give an introduction on our slides, and then Jess on our team is going to work through the rest of those. And I'm going to test sharing my screen right about now. I'm going to probably do the same thing as Jeremy because Google Meets is somewhat confusing to me. No, screen to share. Okay, that should work. And Jess, I will click us through the slides. Just give me your cue. So okay. I'll get us started on this first one. Well, thank you, council members and mayor, for having us as well. As Jeremy noted, our teams worked on a hybrid, innovative approach to get these 2 studies done. And when the 2 RFPs came out, we recognized that it would be an opportunity for our teams to work more efficiently together if we kind of co-bid on it. So we worked hand in glove, whereas Jeremy's team managed the the focus groups and the pop-ups and some of the interviews and that kind of thing, our team focused on the survey that he alluded to. And also there's a lot of overlap between these two topics, but just to try to keep it as simple as possible, Jeremy's team focused on the fair housing side of things, low income populations, historically disadvantaged populations, and how to make sure that they're getting proper resources for housing. Whereas we focused on the entirety of the housing market, publicly provided, privately provided, for rent, for ownership, things that go on the MLS, things that don't go on the MLS, manufactured homes, tiny homes, the whole ball of wax, so to speak. So, same caveat that he provided on that front too, is that there is a challenge that comes. It's a more efficient use of money, but there is challenges that come with trying to put 3 different reports into one. So the way that our team has dealt with that, and I'm sure the draft document that you all have read, that's 200 plus pages, is we broke sections up to address the specific cities where we able to, and that was appropriate. So if you want to see the whole picture for the whole market, you can read the whole report. If you just want the story for Rock Island, there's place for you to read on that front too. So I'll actually take the second slide here too, Jess, before I pass on to you. And just so you know a bit about us, our company is based in North Idaho, but we have a nationwide footprint. So these are just some of the housing and real estate related projects we've done across the country. As you can see, this includes Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Kentucky, just to touch on a few of them from the past few years. So I think one of the advantages that our organization brings is our breadth of understanding of different zoning policies and different ways of cracking the same nut in different places. So we brought that to bear in this case, and looking at 2 more states in Illinois and Iowa. So with that, I will pass that on to you, Jess.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate the introduction. Hello, everybody, Mayor, council members. It's great to speak with you on our research. Before we get into the specific details of our findings, you're probably wondering, well, what is a housing assessment? Basically, it works for both the Tri-Cities and its citizens to figure out what you have and what is needed when it comes to housing, and also takes a lot of different variables into consideration, such as population demographics, building trends, the economy, and of course the community feedback from the survey we did, and of course the land and zoning code. Next slide, please, Brian. And one thing I do want to point out before we get really into it is if you see the term single family, it's referring to a single family detached unit. Now, we're not saying these have to be only single family units. We're just keeping it simpler just for the sake of time. You're probably wondering, what is the purpose of a housing assessment? Well, everybody has a part to play when it comes to housing, whether you're a council member, a regular individual, a developer, or a nonprofit. Everybody has their own experiences and information that's very useful for research, and the market research is necessary for figuring out how to move forward. It provides a guide map of changing something. Next slide, please. Now, before we get to the actual forecast, we're going to talk about the population first, because knowing what your population could be and how it's changing can affect what types of housing you need. So we did 2 different forecasts, just to give a little bit of variety, just in case a little bit of fluctuation happens. A status quo and an optimistic. So the status quo model, it assumes no major changes in industry, housing availability, and other factors. And if Rock Island's population were to go more towards this course, then as with the trends, the population is expected to decline at a steady rate over the next 20 years. However, if it follows more optimistic, on a more positive economic outlook, this could result in up to a 22% population growth by 2044, or roughly about 8,000 people. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. It was just taking a second, a little bit of a lag here. So this, as before, the housing forecasts rely on the status quo and the optimistic approach that were in the previous slide. So with the status quo, housing numbers are expected to decline in the future, but with the optimistic, with the more positive outlook, Rock Island would need roughly 3,700 additional housing units. And one thing I would like to mention before we get on to is past supply is connected to demand in the future. It also shows what kind of construction capacity the region has, such as workforce and other dynamics. And that's why we're going to take a look into permits just to see how things have changed over the years. But with permits, these come sometimes a few months or a year before the certificate of occupancy is issued. There is a lag between the two. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the information on the housing permits that have been issued in Rock Island in the past 20 years. And thank you to the City of Rock Island for providing this information to us. So as you can see, the high point for single family permits was in the early 2000s, and it's fluctuated over the years. But in 2020, there was a spike for single family and also multifamily. However, it has not reached the levels that it once was back in the early 2000s. But multifamily had the highest level reached in the last 20 years. And now this is partially due, or a good chunk of it was due to the Lincoln residences, as those were issued in 2020. And of course, there have been some similar spikes in 2010 and 2013. Next slide, please. Just waiting for the flag to catch up, but just to be safe, I can maybe line. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so yes, so as Brian and Jeremy have stated, we did a community survey to get the citizens' opinions, thoughts about housing. Now, there was a variety of information that was collected, but for the sake of time, we're just going to focus on one specific question that was asked from respondents. Would you like to see additional housing added to the Quad Cities? As you can see, for the City of Rock Island, roughly 15% of individuals that were from Rock Island, roughly 148, they said no, they don't want to see more housing at this time. However, one thing I would like to point out that's actually kind of a good number percentage. It's actually low. In some of our other research on housing needs assessments, a lot of people actually didn't want to see more housing. For example, when we did work in Colorado, 36% of respondents said they didn't want any more housing. And then in Oklahoma, 34% didn't want to see any more housing. So it's nice to see that individuals are more optimistic about housing if it was kind of taken on the right approach. For example, 36% of individuals said they do want to see more housing, but as long as it's a mix of single family and more dense housing options, and 13% said more housing by themselves with high density. And then we're going to take a looking further into the housing situation with costs. Next slide, please, Brian. Okay, so this one talks about the households in Rock Island that can afford to buy an average price home. So as you can see, this provides a variety of different income brackets. So roughly 14% of the individuals who are in the 75 to just under 100,000 income bracket can afford to buy an average price home. And then only 4% of individuals in the 25 to just under 35,000 bracket can afford to buy an average price home, and then 26% are below the necessary income requirements just in general. Well, you're probably wondering, well, that seems kind of odd that someone in the 25 to 35 thousand bracket could afford a house like that. Well, that is there's a couple of reasons. One, that is one of the limitations of the data, with MLS, which is kind of the realtor data source. over time when they look at, information, it's like, oh, okay, this person could afford a mortgage that's at this income level, so we add them into it. So that is one part of it. But what's also another part is what's known as that filtering. This is a common thing in the housing market. So for example, right now, approximately it takes $222,000 to build a single family, 1-story home in Rock Island. And so for individuals who are at a higher income level now, who have a house, say the $75,000, when that new home is built, this gives them the opportunity to step up and move into that new house and put their home they're currently in, that's probably a little older and maybe has less of a value on the market. And this allows individuals who are at the lower income brackets to also step up into that new house. This is what's known as filtering. So this explains a bit of the information. Now we're going to get more into the income, how it's changed over time. Next slide, please, Brian. So now we're looking into how income, rent, and home values has changed over time. So as you can see, for the city of Rock Island, median income has increased by 24% in the last 12 years, which is nice to see. However, home values and median rent has gone up much higher, so it's hard for individuals to keep up with. So in terms of ability to afford a family home, Rock Island citizens are much worse off. However, from the information we found, they are significantly better off than people in the United States, where median rent has gone up 46%. But I think this information we provide in the report will help with individuals deal with that situation. And now we're going to look at the vacancies in Rock Island. Next slide, please, Brian. Okay. Let's see. I think, yeah, you guys can see it. So yeah, vacancies in Rock Island. Rock Island experiences the highest residential vacancy rate within the Tri-Cities at 7%. And as you can see from our map here, most of the vacancy is located along the river. And actually, this is an interesting piece of information. We were able to put this together because of a partnership between the HUD and the United States Postal Service. If you are a designated community, which the city of Rock Island is, they can contact USPS to put this data together. Then they were able to provide us this information so we could draw this map out. As previously stated, its higher vacancies are located along the river, and more specifically, mostly located in the Old Chicago, Douglas Park, and Longview neighborhoods. And for a lot of these vacancies, they've been vacant for over 6 months. And the concentration, higher vacancies along the river, that's actually pretty common in the 3 Tri-Cities that we worked with. And now we're going to get on to some of the recommendations. Now, one thing I'd like to point out before briefly talking about the recommendations is these are just pointing out gaps. We're not saying this is the way you have to do it. We're not saying anything like that. And we're aware the city is not always the ideal organization to address the problem, at least, not alone. We're just giving you a variety of things to work with. So the first one we're going to talk about is with the community revitalization, affordable housing development. And, a lot of these apply to the city of Rock Island, but some don't. For example, number 3, that applies only to Davenport. But since we worked with all 3 cities, we put them all together. And before we really get into the recommendations, I'd like to share some of the progress that cities have made to address revitalization and the blight. Rock Island is the recipient of the Illinois Housing Development Authority HRP Rehabilitation Program grant, which assists low and middle income homeowners with funds to make repairs on their houses. And they also operate a community development block grant to rehab owner occupied housing. And they've also gotten some grant funding from the CSCP2 grant for renovations. And I think they used in the second round was for demolishing some properties that were needed to be torn down. But now we're going to focus on the land banking part of it. So the land banking for the City of Rock Island is the Quad Cities Land Banking Authority, which focuses on acquiring vacant, abandoned properties and working with community partners to revitalizing them and bringing them back to health so they can eventually be sold to new stakeholders, a new home essentially. And by prioritizing the properties, handing them over to land bankings that are vacant, it can really help support economic growth, but also improve the neighborhood quality and stability. And that was actually an interesting part of our research when asking what housing aspects are you dissatisfied with in your community. 54% of respondents said there was too much blight or too many homes in disrepair. And an additional 46% of those individuals said existing homes require too much expensive repair and maintenance issues. So when we did more research on how the land bank could be better utilized, we found that the City of Rock Island, if they were to complete their process for certifying judgment, would really help the process of transferring properties over to the land bank so they could get in the process of fixing these homes up so they could eventually be put back on the market. And now with the Step Up housing program, a good example of this would be in Bisbee, Arizona, which they have a Step Up Bisbee. Essentially what this type of organization program would do is they work with a person, an LLC, or a corporation to buy a property that's blighted, needs repairs at a discount. And while it's under the ownership of a LLC corporation, they make the repairs, and then eventually the corporation donates it to a city or a 501c3. What's really nice about this is they are offered up to a 30% tax deduction on their adjusted gross income, which could amount to $50,000, depending on your tax income bracket, in order to do this. And then eventually the Step Up program organization sells these properties, homes, at a 20% discounted price from the appraised value to community needed workers such as policemen, teachers, city workers, etc. And then the proceeds go back into the program so they can continue to do this. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is sponsoring a community land trust. And for those who aren't familiar with the community land trust, it's a private, nonprofit membership-based organization that acquires parcels of land, for home ownership, and then they lease the property to individuals who live on a housing unit that's just on the land, but they don't retain ownership of the land. And this kind of helps reduce the cost because neither party owns both the house and the land, so how much it costs is significantly lower. Sometimes when you look in Zillow, you'll see a house that's significantly higher in cost, but you'll just see an open parcel of land that isn't worth as much because there's no infrastructure, there's no house on it, so it needs a lot of work, so it's not worth as much. So by doing this, it saves individuals a lot of their income on housing. So good examples that the City of Rock Island could look to just for some guidance how to do a good land trust would be the Story County Community Housing Corporation and also the Chicago Housing Trust. They got some pretty good programs set up, and more than information can be found in our report. The next example I'd like to show is tapping into the Illinois Housing Development Authority's mortgage programs. They have 3 different programs right now, and essentially their purpose is to lower the costs of housing when purchasing a home. They provide assistance and funding for down payments and closing costs. They are similar, but a little different. They're all loans. Some don't have to be paid back as long as you remain in the house for a certain amount of period of time. And then some are repayable after you sell the house or after the mortgage is paid off. And again, the number 3 is just for the city of Davenport, but since we were working with all 3 cities, we thought we would put them all together. And then number 4 is on the encouraging more high density, low maintenance units in urban cores. Some from the research we found, 19% of households are just classified as one-person households. And a lot of these households are very interested in townhomes, apartments, that sort of thing. And developers are very interested in, these types of housing because they can put more units on the same parcel of land. So essentially they're getting more bang for your buck, because that is kind of one of the issues with developing single family homes is the margins are getting smaller. So they also like, multifamily, because again, you can get more bang for your buck. So essentially, Rock Island leads Tri-Cities when it comes to these one-person households. So this could be an interesting opportunity, for developers and also providing more housing. And there are several zoning districts that could be targeted in Rock Island for these. So specifically, business districts B1, 2, and 3 are partially amenable to mixed use. Now, B1 is intended for, sales and services. However, another principal thing that is permitted is allowing dwellings above the first floor. And B2 and B3 can also do this as B1, as long as it goes through the approval process of being reviewed and being approved by the zoning board. Now, R4 district, it can also have something similar. It's classified as high density and is judged by unit, not so much the square footage. So Rock Island could possibly offer a density bonus in the R4 district to developers that are building smaller, high density units. And this could also provide the opportunity for really bringing revenue to kind of the more high density areas. When we spoke with a developer, a part of our research, he says we need to bring people back downtown in order to generate revenue for the city. And this actually aligns with some of the other research we got from the community survey when we asked where would multifamily high density units should be. A lot of them said right or just behind a commercial corridors would be the best suitable locations. So encouraging this could provide affordable housing options while also keeping maintenance for these units down and also bring revenue to the city. Okay, are there any questions from any council members? Anybody?
Anybody have any questions? We're a little short of time, but don't see any questions on this end. Appreciate the presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, Nicole, is that it?
The presentations for today, the full draft reports were also sent out, so all of that information are in those large documents. So please reach out if anybody has any questions on those documents or any comments that I can take on that, and I'd be happy to incorporate those into the reports. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. All right, next up, we got the Parkway I-280. Tom, are you making that, or who's?
Yeah, I just want to check. It looked like Jared from Moran Economic Development was on the line.
He is.
Jared, can you hear us?
Can't hear him. Something happened with the screen. There we go.
There you go. Jared, are you able to hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Perfect. We are very short on time, so if you want to blaze through these slides, we'd appreciate it.
I'll go as fast as I can. Okay, so a couple things tonight. We're talking about both a amendment to the TIF district and the establishment of a new business district. And both of those processes are different projects, but because both areas overlay each other and because the statutory requirements for both processes are similar, we're going to be talking about them essentially together. So at the next council meeting, we're going to ask that you pass the ordinance that establishes the public hearing date for both of those projects. And I can pull up my screen here, my slides. Let's see. Okay. Can you guys see the slide now?
Yes.
Okay, so the boundary area we're talking about is adjacent to the existing Parkway I-280 TIF district. So the business district would take in all of the properties shown. The TIF district would just be all of the properties minus those properties that are currently in the TIF. But basically, when you are going to add property to an existing TIF district, the establishment or the amendment process is largely the same as the establishment process. So this is going to be very similar to what we just did for the downtown TIF. So we found that there's 57 parcels of property in the amended area for the TIF. similar to a new TIF, that area has to qualify. So things we're talking about there is that the area would qualify as a conservation and blighted area, a combination of both of those things as they apply to the developed and undeveloped portions of the TIF area. Things we're talking about is a lack of community planning was noted. As you can see in the picture, there's floodplain issues, and overall there's characteristics of these parcels that meet or exceed the minimum threshold for TIF qualification purposes. And ultimately, if the TIF were to be expanded to include these parcels of property, it would be a tool that would be appropriate for accomplishing some of the city's goals within this area. So jumping over to the business district, the qualifications for a business district are a little bit different, but ultimately a lot of the same things we're talking about apply to the business district eligibility. But ultimately for the business district, we have to have a finding that the area is a variety of sort of outcomes. But what we found in this case was that these properties could be considered to be an economic liability to the city, and also that the properties are economically underutilized. And what that means is that for the economic liability, we found that the area as a whole has had some lower growth rates than the CPI, which is in those years it exceeds the statutory benchmark for what could be considered a stagnant or in decline redevelopment project area. And then for the underutilization, it's basically if the city were to have a tool or a resource to overcome some of those characteristics, that these properties could in turn be developed, which would generate more sales for those commercial entities, and then also property taxes for general development in the area. So with that, the goal here would be to essentially provide a resource for infrastructure and utilities, just to make more of these properties viable as development sites in the future. Again, when you're talking about redevelopment project funds, there's only certain eligible costs, and those eligible costs are generally thought of things that make improvements within the boundary area. So infrastructure, utilities, engineering, all of those things are what we're talking about as far as what the city would like to use redevelopment project funds for. With the TIF district expiring, the last payment there would be 2027, payable 2028. You only have a couple payments left there, but as the existing redevelopment agreements expire, you pay those off. You're going to have a little bit of funding to use in conjunction with the retail sales collections that the business district would then add to. So you could use both of those funds together, and the business district would obviously have a longer life than the TIF. But having some of that TIF money available would jumpstart some development in the area, which overall would be a tool that could be used to overcome some of those conditions noted. So with that, like I said, we just wanted to give a brief overview about, would this be feasible from the TIF side, and also would the area qualify from the business district side? So that way, when you're considering that ordinance to establish the public hearing date, you know that the areas both would qualify, and if the city ultimately chooses, you could follow through with the amendment of the TIF district and the establishment of that business district. But going over the next steps here, as I said, establishing that public hearing date and time. Public hearing both for the amendment and for the business district establishment are required by statute. We would have to have a joint review board meeting for the TIF district, which would be set for February 5th. That public hearing, as I mentioned, would be set for March 17th. And then ultimately, we would have consideration for the ordinance establishing the business district at the March 24th meeting, and then the TIF would be following that at the April 14th. So hopefully that was quick enough, but I would be happy to answer any questions should anybody have any at this time.
Okay, I know that was quick. Everybody comfortable with that? Understand? I think we're fine here.
All righty.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank you very much.
Move to adjourn.
There's a motion to adjourn. Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Adjourned until 6:45.